The November wind cut through Malachite like a blade, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the bitter promise of a hard winter ahead. Martha Henley pulled her shawl tighter as she hurried down Main Street, her boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk in rhythm with her anxious thoughts. The harvest had been poor this year, and already she could see the signs of struggle etched into the faces of her neighbors, the way Mrs. Preston's shoulders sagged as she counted coins at the general store, how young Tom Bradley's clothes hung loose on his thinning frame, the manner in which conversations died when talk turned to winter preparations and what might be lacking in each household's stores. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders, a sea of brown grass that whispered of promises broken and dreams deferred. This was the kind of country that tested a person's mettle with each passing season, where the line between survival and catastrophe was measured in inches of rainfall and degrees of temperature. Martha had lived here long enough to read the signs written in the land itself, the way the cottonwoods along Miller Creek had shed their leaves earlier than usual, how the wild geese had passed through in smaller numbers, the thickness of the rabbits' coats when Benjamin Tucker brought them to market. All of it spoke of a winter that would demand more than any of them were prepared to give. But nowhere was the weight of hardship more visible than in the two small figures who emerged from the alley beside Cooper's feed store like shadows given form. Lucy and Samuel Moody, 8 years old and mirror images of determination wrapped in threadbare coats, stepped into the pale afternoon light with the careful deliberation of children who had learned too early that each movement must serve a purpose. Their matching brown eyes held depths that no child should possess, the kind of quiet knowing that came from watching parents waste away with fever and being left to make sense of death before they had fully grasped the meaning of life. Martha's heart clenched as she watched them, the familiar ache of maternal concern mixing with the helpless frustration she felt whenever she encountered the Moody twins. 6 months had passed since consumption had claimed their parents within a week of each other, leaving the children to fend for themselves in the abandoned soddy 3 miles outside town. She remembered Elizabeth Moody as a gentle woman with capable hands and a voice like meadowlark song, how she would bring her preserves to church socials and always have a kind word for anyone struggling with their own burdens. James Moody had been a man of few words but steady character, the kind of neighbor who showed up without being asked when there was work to be done or trouble to be faced. The church ladies had tried to place the twins with families after the funeral, but times were lean throughout the territory, and mouths to feed were luxuries few could afford. The Hendersons had kept them for nearly a month before their own baby took sick and Sarah Henderson's nerves gave out under the strain. The Prestons had lasted 3 weeks before admitting they simply didn't have enough food to share. Even the Weatherbys, who had more than most, found that their own teenage sons resented having to compete with strangers for their parents' attention and their families' resources. Each placement had ended the same way, with the twins slipping away in the early morning hours and returning always to the crumbling walls of the only home they remembered, as if proximity to their parents' memory could somehow fill the hollow spaces in their bellies or warm the cold corners of their hearts. The ladies had eventually given up their efforts, though not without considerable hand-wringing and guilty consciences. What else could they do? The children seemed determined to remain independent, and forcing the issue would require resources and authority that none of them possessed. So Lucy and Samuel had become fixtures on the edges of Malachite society, appearing in town every few days to trade whatever they could forage or fashion for the bare necessities that kept them alive. Martha had seen them bartering wild herbs with Doc Wilson, trading carved wooden trinkets with anyone who might spare a few coins, offering to do odd jobs for shopkeepers in exchange for day-old bread or bruised apples. They had adapted to their circumstances with the remarkable resilience of children, but Martha could see the toll it was taking in the way their clothes hung looser each week, how their eyes had developed a constant vigilance that no 8-year-old should need to carry. Today, Lucy carried a tin bucket that had seen better days, its handle wrapped with strips of cloth to keep it from cutting into her small palm. The bucket had belonged to their mother, Martha remembered, used for gathering eggs from the henhouse that was now empty and collecting berries from the wild patches that grew along the creek. Samuel clutched a bundle of something wrapped in what had once been their mother's good apron, the faded blue fabric now stained with the evidence of their scavenging. Berry juice, mud from the creek bed, the rusty marks of wild onions pulled from the earth with desperate fingers. They moved with the silent communication of twins who had learned to read each other's thoughts, Lucy nodding toward the bucket while Samuel adjusted his grip on their mysterious bundle. There was something different about them today, Martha realized as she studied their faces. Beneath the usual wariness lay an undercurrent of excitement, the kind of purposeful energy that came when children had discovered something important and were trying to decide what to do about it. Martha found herself slowing her pace, her original destination, Widow Preston's house, to discuss the church's winter relief efforts, forgotten in the face of her curiosity and concern. The twins had captured her attention the way a distant storm cloud might draw the eye of a farmer, promising something significant was approaching even if its exact nature remained unclear. "Lucy, Samuel," she called softly, not wanting to startle them. The children froze like deer caught in an open meadow, their matching brown eyes wide with the particular wariness of those who had learned that adult attention often came with conditions they couldn't meet or expectations they couldn't fulfill. For a moment, Martha saw them as they truly were, not the plucky orphans of storybook tales, but two frightened children carrying burdens far too heavy for their small shoulders. They stood poised for flight, every muscle tense with the readiness to disappear back into the maze of alleys and abandoned buildings where adults couldn't follow, where they could make decisions based on their own understanding of what survival required rather than the well-meaning but often impractical advice of grown-ups who had never had to choose between dignity and death. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henley," Lucy said finally, her voice carrying the careful politeness their mother had drilled into them before the sickness came. Elizabeth Moody had been particular about manners, believing that courtesy cost nothing and could sometimes mean the difference between kindness and dismissal from strangers. Samuel remained silent beside his sister, but his free hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious comfort of two halves of the same whole. "What brings you to town today?" Martha asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. The twins made regular trips to Malachite, their appearances timed to coincide with market days when there might be extra work available or sympathetic shopkeepers willing to part with goods that wouldn't keep much longer. They had learned the rhythms of commerce and charity, understanding instinctively when to approach and when to stay hidden. The children exchanged one of their wordless conversations, brown eyes meeting brown eyes in a dance of communication that never failed to remind Martha of their lost parents. James and Elizabeth had shared a similar connection, the kind of deep partnership that allowed them to work in perfect harmony whether they were building fence lines or planning their children's future. That future had been cut short by disease and bad luck, but something of their parents' unity lived on in the way the twins navigated the world together. "We found something," Samuel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Lucy, who nodded encouragingly. "Someone who needs help." Martha felt her eyebrows rise. In a town where everyone was struggling to some degree, where even the most prosperous families were tightening their belts and making difficult choices about what luxuries they could afford, the idea that two children living on the margins of survival might have found someone in worse straits seemed not just unlikely but almost impossible. What kind of desperation would make someone appear needy to children who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and a crumbling shelter that wouldn't last another hard winter? "Oh?" she prompted, her curiosity now fully engaged. There was something in the twins' manner that suggested this wasn't just another hard-luck story they had encountered in their wanderings. Their excitement was tempered by genuine concern, the kind of emotional investment that came when children recognized a problem they believed they could solve. Lucy shifted the bucket to her other hand, and Martha caught a glimpse of its contents, strips of dried meat that looked precious as gold, a few withered apples that had probably been saved from the last edible batch they could find, what looked like the final jar of preserves from their mother's pantry, the glass catching the afternoon light like a small treasure. These weren't random scraps they were carrying, but deliberate provisions, carefully chosen and hoarded for a specific purpose. "There's a man," Lucy began, then stopped, looking to her brother for support. Even at 8 years old, she seemed to understand that what they were about to reveal would change something, would draw adult attention to a situation they had been handling on their own. "He's hurt," Samuel continued where she left off. "Been sleeping rough in the old Miller place. Haven't seen him in town, so we figured." He trailed off, the adult reasoning in his child's voice both heartbreaking and remarkable. They had learned to think like grown-ups because survival required it, weighing possibilities and making judgments that should have been years beyond their experience. The Miller place. Martha knew it well, a homestead that had been abandoned 2 years back when drought and grasshoppers had driven the family east, back to relatives in Missouri who could offer them shelter and a fresh start. It sat about a mile from the twins' own soddy, a skeleton of broken dreams with a roof that leaked and walls that barely held back the wind. The Miller family had been decent folks, hard-working and optimistic, but the prairie had ground them down the way it ground down so many others who came west with hopes bigger than their understanding of what the land would demand. If someone was sheltering there as winter approached, they were either desperate or dying, possibly both. The structure was barely adequate for storage, let alone human habitation. The roof had lost most of its sod covering, leaving gaps that would let in rain and snow. The walls were settling badly, creating drafts that would make the interior nearly as cold as the outdoors. No one would choose the Miller place as shelter unless they had exhausted every other option. "A stranger?" Martha asked, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she contemplated the violence that sometimes drifted through their territory with the traveling men. Drifters, outlaws, men running from something or toward it, the frontier attracted all kinds, and not all of them were safe for children to encounter. She had heard stories from other towns, tales of wanderers who took advantage of isolated families or carried diseases and dangers that peaceful communities weren't equipped to handle. "He's not dangerous," Lucy said quickly, as if reading Martha's thoughts with the same intuitive skill she used to communicate with her brother. "He's just hungry. Real hungry. And sick, maybe." Samuel saw him trying to catch fish in Miller's old pond with his bare hands. The image struck Martha with unexpected force. Miller's pond was little more than a muddy depression that collected rainwater, barely deep enough to attract frogs, let alone fish. For a man to be reduced to groping in such a place for sustenance spoke of a desperation that went beyond ordinary hunger. It suggested someone who had been without proper food for so long that even the most futile efforts seemed worth attempting. Samuel nodded solemnly. "Didn't even run when he saw me watching. Just sat back on his heels and looked so." He struggled for words, his 8-year-old vocabulary failing to capture whatever expression he had witnessed on the stranger's face. The boy's own features were troubled, as if he had seen something that disturbed him on a level he couldn't quite articulate. "Tired," Lucy supplied, providing the word her brother couldn't find. He looked tired all the way through to his bones. Like when Papa got sick, and even sitting up in bed seemed too hard. The comparison to their father's final days hung in the air between them, heavy with memory and understanding. Martha remembered James Moody's last weeks, how the consumption had drained not just his strength but his will, leaving him a shadow of the vital man he had been. If the twins were seeing similar signs in this stranger, the situation was more serious than simple hunger or temporary hardship. Martha felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the practical caution that had kept her own family fed and safe through lean times and dangerous seasons. She recognized the look the twins described because she had seen it in her own mirror during the hardest months after her husband's accident, when every day had been a battle not just to survive but to find reasons why survival was worth the effort. The bone-deep exhaustion that came not just from hunger, but from the weight of enduring each day without hope for the next, without faith that circumstances would ever improve. "And you want to help him," she said, not making it a question. Of course they did. Despite everything they had endured, despite the way the world had taken their parents and left them to scratch out an existence from the unforgiving prairie, despite having every justification to think only of their own survival, their first instinct upon finding someone worse off than themselves was to share what little they had. The simple goodness of it took Martha's breath away. These children, who had every reason to become hard and selfish, had instead chosen compassion. They had looked at their meager resources and decided that someone else's need was greater than their own. It was the kind of fundamental decency that her mother used to say was the true measure of a person's character, not what they did when they had plenty to spare, but how they responded when generosity required real sacrifice. "Mama always said that when you're hungry, you remember what it feels like," Lucy said, her voice carrying the simple wisdom of a woman who had known hardship and taught her children to respond with kindness rather than bitterness. She said that makes you able to see it in others, even when they try to hide it. Elizabeth Moody's words, spoken months ago but preserved in her daughter's memory like pressed flowers in a book, carried across the distance between life and death to shape the present moment. Martha could almost hear Elizabeth's voice in Lucy's careful pronunciation, the way she had probably repeated the lesson during their own lean times, teaching her children that suffering could be transformed into empathy if they chose to let it. Samuel hefted the bundle in his arms, his small muscles straining against the weight of whatever provisions they had gathered. "We made extra cornbread yesterday, and we found some late berries by the creek. Won't last us long anyway, with winter coming." He shrugged, as if the logic were self-evident. When you had nothing to spare, you shared what you had, because tomorrow you might be the one in need, and the world was too harsh a place to face alone. The matter-of-fact way he spoke about their own deprivation struck Martha like a physical blow. These children had learned to live with uncertainty as their constant companion, to make peace with the knowledge that their next meal was never guaranteed. Yet instead of hoarding their resources or becoming desperate and grasping, they had chosen to extend their circle of care to include a stranger whose name they didn't even know. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and unexpected in the cold afternoon air. She had been so focused on her own family struggles, so consumed with stretching every dollar and rationing every meal to see them through the winter ahead, that she had nearly forgotten the most basic truth of frontier life: they survived together or not at all. These children, who had every reason to hoard their meager resources, were preparing to give them away to a stranger simply because he needed them more. The shame of her own narrow focus was almost overwhelming. While she had been calculating and planning and worrying about her own household, 2 orphan children had been quietly living out the gospel of love and service that the preacher talked about every Sunday, but that few adults seemed able to practice when it required real sacrifice. They had found someone suffering and responded with immediate, practical compassion, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing they had done what their hearts told them was right. "Would you like some help?" she heard herself asking, though her practical mind immediately began calculating what she could spare from her own pantry without putting her family at risk. The twins looked up at her with matching expressions of surprise and gratitude, as if the offer of adult assistance was an unexpected gift rather than the natural response to their obvious need. "We don't want to be trouble," Lucy said automatically, the response of a child who had learned that accepting help often came with obligations they couldn't fulfill or conditions they couldn't meet. Too many adults had offered assistance with hidden expectations, thinking they were being generous when they were actually creating debts the children could never repay. "Helping isn't trouble," Martha replied, echoing words her own mother had spoken decades ago during another hard winter when neighbors had meant the difference between survival and disaster. "It's just what neighbors do." The phrase carried the weight of tradition, of values passed down through generations of people who had learned that cooperation wasn't just morally right but practically necessary on the frontier. Samuel's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, transforming his serious little face into something bright and hopeful. "He's really sick, Mrs. Henley. Been coughing something fierce, and his clothes are all torn up." Samuel tried to get close enough to talk to him yesterday, but he just shook his head and waved us away. The image of a grown man refusing help from children struck Martha as particularly heartbreaking. Whatever pride or shame was keeping the stranger isolated, it must be powerful indeed to overcome the basic human need for connection and assistance. She had seen it before in her husband after his accident, the way wounded pride could become its own kind of prison, keeping people trapped in suffering rather than accepting the help that could set them free. "Some folks don't know how to accept kindness," Martha observed, speaking from years of experience with stubborn men who would rather suffer in silence than admit they needed anything from anybody. Especially when they're proud men who aren't used to needing help. The frontier attracted independent souls, people who prided themselves on their self-sufficiency and their ability to handle whatever challenges life threw at them. When such people found themselves truly helpless, the psychological adjustment could be as painful as any physical injury. Lucy nodded sagely, her 8-year-old face wearing an expression of wisdom that belonged on someone decades older. "That's what we figured. So we thought if we just left food where he could find it, maybe he'd eat it without feeling bad about taking charity." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, showing an understanding of human nature that many adults never developed. By removing the direct exchange, by allowing the stranger to maintain the fiction that he was finding rather than receiving, they had found a way to offer help while preserving his dignity. The strategy was so purely innocent in its logic, yet so sophisticated in its psychological understanding, that Martha felt her heart swell with something she couldn't quite name. These children had instinctively grasped what many adults never learned, that sometimes the greatest kindness was allowing someone to receive help without losing their self-respect. They had found a way to be generous without making the recipient feel diminished, to offer love without demanding gratitude in return. "That's very wise," she said, and meant it. "But maybe we can do a little more than just leave food. Winter's coming hard this year, and the Miller place isn't fit for man or beast. Maybe between the three of us, we can convince him to come into town, get some proper help." The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this situation required more than anonymous charity. If the man was as sick as the children described, he would need medical attention, shelter, and sustained care to survive the coming months. The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, brown eyes meeting brown eyes in the dance of communication that never failed to remind Martha of their lost parents. She could see them weighing possibilities, considering objections, reaching the kind of wordless agreement that came from complete trust and shared understanding. Finally, Lucy spoke for both of them. "We'd be grateful for the company," she said formally, her careful manners making her sound like a miniature adult. "And he might listen to a grown-up better than he'd listen to us." There was pragmatism in her acceptance, the recognition that their good intentions might not be enough to overcome whatever barriers were keeping the stranger isolated. Samuel nodded earnestly. "Besides, Mrs. Henley, you know things about medicine and such. Maybe you could tell if he's really sick or just hungry." His faith in adult knowledge was touching, the assumption that grown-ups possessed wisdom and skills that could solve problems beyond children's capabilities. Martha did know things frontier women had to. She could set bones, treat fever, stitch wounds that would otherwise fester, and recognize the signs of serious illness that required more intervention than home remedies could provide. She had delivered babies, nursed families through epidemics, and laid out the dead when their suffering finally ended. These skills weren't exceptional in her world. They were simply part of what women learned when medical help was days away and survival depended on neighbors caring for each other. If this stranger was truly in bad shape, he would need more than the twins' cornbread and good intentions to see him through the winter. He would need systematic care, proper nutrition, and possibly intervention from Doc Wilson if his condition was severe enough. But first, someone would have to assess the situation, determine what kind of help was actually needed, and figure out how to provide it without damaging the man's pride or creating obligations he couldn't fulfill. "Very well then," she said, her decision crystallizing with the kind of clarity that came when the heart finally aligned with the head. "Let me go home and gather a few things. Can you meet me at the end of Main Street in an hour?" Already she was mentally inventorying what she could contribute to the mission. Her medical supplies, some of her husband's old clothes that had been gathering dust in the chest, food that could be shared without putting her own family at risk. The twins nodded eagerly, their faces bright with the excitement of children who had been carrying a burden alone and were now going to share it with someone capable of helping them bear the weight. Their relief was palpable, the visible loosening of shoulders that had been carrying too much responsibility for too long. "And children," Martha added, her voice soft with emotion. "What you're doing, your mama and papa would be very proud." The words came from her heart, spoken with the conviction of someone who had known their parents and understood the values Elizabeth and James Moody had tried to instill in their offspring. Lucy's eyes grew bright with unshed tears, while Samuel straightened his shoulders as if taking on the weight of that approval like a mantle of honor. They had been carrying so much on their own for so long, Martha realized. Not just the burden of physical survival, but the responsibility of living up to their parents' memory, of proving that the lessons they had learned in their brief 8 years were strong enough to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding and shared purpose. Then the twins turned and began to make their way back toward the outskirts of town, their small forms moving with the purposeful stride of people who had important work to do. Martha watched them go, marveling at the way they seemed to carry themselves taller now that their secret mission had become a shared endeavor. As she turned toward home, Martha felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced years ago when she first held her own newborn children, or when she had watched her husband take his first tentative steps after his accident had left him bedridden for months. It was hope, pure and unexpected, rising from the ashes of a hard season like green shoots pushing through late snow, defying the darkness to reach toward light. She walked with purpose now, already planning what she would need for the journey to the Miller place and the encounter with the mysterious stranger. There was a pot of bean soup that could be stretched to feed an extra mouth, some of her husband's flannel shirts that would provide warmth against the coming cold, a bottle of the cough syrup she made from pine needles and honey that had proven effective against chest ailments. Small things, perhaps, but she had learned long ago that grace often came packaged in small things, delivered by the hands of those who could least afford to give. The wind still carried the promise of winter, but somehow it no longer felt quite so sharp against her face. Behind her, the sounds of Malachite continued their familiar rhythm, the creak of wagon wheels over wooden planks, the low voices of men conducting the daily business that kept their small community functioning, the distant laughter of children playing in the last precious hours before darkness would drive them indoors. It was the music of a community, she realized, each voice adding its own note to the larger song of survival and hope and human connection. And somewhere on the outskirts of that community, in the broken shell of the Miller homestead, a stranger waited without knowing that help was coming. That 2 orphan children who had every reason to think only of their own survival had instead chosen to think of him. That the simple act of offering a meal to someone hungrier than themselves was about to ripple outward in ways none of them could imagine, touching hearts and changing lives in the quiet, persistent way that genuine kindness always managed to accomplish. Martha quickened her pace, eager now to begin whatever small part she was meant to play in the story that was just beginning to unfold. Behind her, the November wind carried with it something new. Not just the scent of coming snow and the whisper of winter's approach, but the promise of possibility, the assurance that even in the darkest seasons, even when resources were scarce and times were hard, light could still find a way to shine through the cracks in human suffering, illuminating paths toward redemption that no one could have predicted or planned. An hour later, Martha stood at the end of Main Street with a canvas satchel slung across her shoulder and a basket balanced in the crook of her arm, watching the twins approach through the gathering dusk. They moved like small ghosts across the prairie grass, their figures barely visible against the darkening landscape until they were close enough for her to make out their faces. Lucy still carried the tin bucket, now joined by what appeared to be a worn quilt bundled under her free arm. Samuel had traded his earlier package for a larger bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and Martha could see the careful way he carried it that whatever lay inside was precious to them. "We brought blankets," Lucy announced without preamble as they drew near. "And some of Papa's old tools, in case the man needs to fix things or make a shelter better." Her practical thinking impressed Martha once again. These children had learned to anticipate needs, to think beyond immediate problems toward longer-term solutions. Samuel hefted his bundle slightly. "And Mama's medicine bag. She always said willow bark tea was good for fever, and we found some by the creek last week." The bag had belonged to Elizabeth Moody, Martha remembered, passed down from her own mother who had served as midwife and healer for 3 counties back in Ohio. The twins were carrying forward not just their parents' possessions, but their knowledge and traditions. Martha felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Your parents taught you well," she said simply. "Shall we go meet this stranger of yours?" The walk to the Miller place took them across terrain that told the story of every family who had tried to make a life in this unforgiving country. They passed the Johnsons' abandoned claim, marked now only by a stone foundation and the skeleton of what had once been a barn. The Kowalskis' place showed more recent habitation, smoke rising from the chimney and a few scraggly chickens pecking in the yard, but Martha could see the signs of struggle: the sagging roof that needed repair, the garden plot that had yielded poorly, the way Stephen Kowalski's shoulders curved inward with the weight of disappointment and failing hope. "There," Samuel said suddenly, pointing toward a depression in the land where the Miller homestead sat like a broken tooth against the horizon. "That's where we saw him." The structure was worse than Martha remembered. 2 years of neglect had taken their toll, leaving gaps in the sod walls where chunks had fallen away and exposing the rough timber framework beneath. The door hung at an angle, one hinge torn loose from its mooring. What remained of the roof showed patches of sky through holes where the sod covering had eroded or been carried away by wind and weather. As they drew closer, Martha caught sight of movement near what had once been the homestead's well. A figure hunched over the stone-lined opening, and even from a distance she could see the desperate quality of his movements as he worked the rope that operated the bucket mechanism. The twins had been right about his condition. There was something in his posture that spoke of profound exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting a losing battle against circumstances beyond one's control. "He's been trying to get water all afternoon," Lucy whispered, unconsciously lowering her voice as if they were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden sound. "But the rope keeps breaking. Samuel thinks maybe he's too weak to pull it up proper." Martha studied the stranger more carefully as they approached. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, though hardship had aged him beyond his time. His clothes, once good quality from what she could discern, hung in tatters that spoke of long weeks on the trail and rough sleeping. Dark hair fell across his face as he bent over the well, hiding his features, but she could see the tremor in his hands and the way he had to pause frequently to catch his breath. The sound of their footsteps on the hard-packed earth around the homestead caused him to look up sharply, and Martha found herself looking into eyes that held depths of suffering she hadn't expected. They were green, she noticed with surprise, an unusual color in these parts, and they held an intelligence that suggested education and refinement despite his current circumstances. But it was the expression in those eyes that caught her breath, not just hunger or pain, but a kind of hopeless resignation that spoke of a man who had given up expecting anything good to happen to him. He straightened slowly, his movement careful in the way of someone whose body had betrayed them more than once. Martha estimated his height at just over 6 feet, but he was gaunt in the manner of someone who had been without proper nutrition for weeks rather than days. His skin had the grayish pallor that came with serious illness, and she could hear the rasp of his breathing even from several yards away. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had been educated back east, though it was roughened now by whatever respiratory ailment plagued him. "I'm sorry if I've trespassed on your property. I can move on if you need me to." The courtesy was automatic, ingrained, the response of someone who had been taught proper manners and hadn't forgotten them despite his current straits. Martha felt her heart clench at the resigned way he spoke, as if he had grown accustomed to being unwelcome wherever he went. "This isn't my property," she said gently. "And you're not trespassing. These children were concerned about you and asked me to come along." The stranger's gaze shifted to Lucy and Samuel, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or embarrassment that children had witnessed his desperation. "I told them I was fine," he said, though the statement was contradicted by everything about his appearance and condition. "They shouldn't be worrying about strangers." "Children worry about what touches their hearts," Martha replied, setting down her basket and moving closer to the well. "And hearts don't recognize strangers, only fellow human beings in need." She peered down into the darkness of the well shaft. "Rope's frayed," she observed. "Probably rotted through from the weather. Do you have anything we could splice it with?" The man looked at her with an expression of bewilderment, as if kindness was a language he had forgotten how to understand. There might be some wire in the barn. The Millers left tools behind." He paused, studying her face as if trying to determine whether her offer of help was genuine or some kind of elaborate cruelty. "I'm grateful for the thought, but I can't pay you for assistance." Martha felt a surge of anger at whatever experiences had taught this man to expect payment for basic human kindness, but she kept her voice level. "Did I mention payment? Must have slipped my mind." She turned to Samuel. "Would you mind fetching that wire while I take a look at our patient here?" "Patient?" The stranger stepped back instinctively. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not looking for charity." "Good," Martha said briskly, opening her satchel and pulling out the bottle of cough syrup she had brought. "Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering medicine to someone who's obviously fighting off a chest infection, and common sense says we get you stronger before winter sets in proper." She studied his face, noting the flush of fever across his cheekbones and the way his eyes seemed slightly unfocused. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, as if he couldn't remember or was embarrassed to admit the truth. Lucy stepped forward, her bucket clutched in both hands. "We brought food," she said simply. "Enough to share." She looked up at the stranger with the direct gaze that children possessed before the world taught them to hide their intentions. "What's your name?" "Mama always said it was easier to help people when you knew what to call them." The man's eyes softened slightly at her forthright manner. "Thomas," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Thomas Gibson." The name seemed to come from some deep place, as if he hadn't spoken it aloud in a long time. "I'm Lucy, and this is Samuel," Lucy replied gravely. "And this is Mrs. Henley. She knows about healing people." She paused, then added with the logic of childhood, "Are you a cowboy? You look like the cowboys Papa used to hire for roundup." Thomas Gibson managed a smile that transformed his haggard features. "I was for a time. Among other things." His voice carried a note of something that might have been nostalgia or regret. "Been a while since anyone called me that." Samuel returned from his expedition to the barn carrying a coil of rusty wire and what appeared to be a pair of pliers. "Found these too," he announced proudly. "And there's some lumber that's still good, if we need to shore up anything." He looked at Thomas with the measuring gaze of someone much older than his years. "You planning to winter here?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Thomas glanced around at the deteriorating homestead, then back at the small group that had appeared in his life like some impossible answer to prayers he hadn't dared to voice. "Hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Been taking things one day at a time for longer than I care to remember." The honesty in his voice suggested a man who had been stripped of pretense by circumstances, reduced to the essential truth of survival. Martha finished her preliminary examination with the practiced eye of someone who had nursed families through everything from childhood fevers to consumption. The signs were troubling but not hopeless. Malnutrition certainly, exhaustion that went bone deep, and what appeared to be a persistent respiratory infection that needed attention before it progressed to something more serious. But underneath the ravages of hardship, she could see the framework of a fundamentally strong constitution, someone who would respond well to proper care if they could convince him to accept it. "Mr. Gibson," she said, her tone carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed in matters of health. "I'm going to speak plainly because I don't have time for dancing around delicate feelings. You're sick, you're starving, and winter's coming whether any of us are ready for it or not. Now, you can accept help gracefully, or you can keep trying to handle things alone and likely die before Christmas. The choice is yours, but these children have gone to considerable trouble to help you, and I'd hate to see their efforts wasted on stubborn pride." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Martha could see the internal battle playing out across his features. Pride warred with pragmatism, independence with the desperate need for human connection. Finally, something in his expression cracked, like ice breaking under the pressure of a spring thaw. "I don't know why you'd want to help me," he said quietly. "Don't even know why these children would care about a stranger who has nothing to offer in return." Lucy stepped closer, her bucket still clutched in her small hands. "Mama used to say that people don't help because they expect something back. They help because it's what people do when they remember they're all in this world together." She paused, then added with the devastating honesty of childhood, "Besides, we know what it's like to be hungry and scared. Nobody should have to feel that way alone." The simple words seemed to strike Thomas Gibson like a physical blow. Martha watched as his carefully maintained composure finally crumbled, his shoulders sagging as months or perhaps years of accumulated pain and isolation finally found release. He didn't break down completely. Pride wouldn't allow that, but she could see the moment when his resistance finally gave way to acceptance. "I was a schoolteacher," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if a dam had burst. "Back in Kansas. Had a good position, respected in the community. Then the drought came, and the school couldn't afford to keep me on. Tried farming for a while, but I didn't have the capital to weather the bad years. Lost everything." He paused, looking out across the darkening prairie. "Been wandering ever since, picking up work where I could find it. Cowhand, railroad man, whatever would keep body and soul together." Martha nodded, recognizing the familiar story of displacement and disappointment that had driven so many people to desperate measures. The frontier was littered with the dreams of those who had come west expecting opportunity and found only hardship beyond their ability to endure. "What brought you to this particular corner of nowhere?" she asked gently, beginning to unpack the food she had brought while Samuel worked to repair the well rope with the focused intensity of a child given an important task. Thomas watched the boy's efforts with an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone was working on his behalf without expectation of reward. "Horse went lame about 10 miles back. Had to put him down." The words carried a weight of grief that spoke of more than just the loss of transportation. "He was a good horse. Deserved better than what I could give him." Lucy set down her bucket and moved to stand beside Thomas, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm with the instinctive comfort gesture of a child who understood loss. "We had to leave our animals behind when Mama and Papa died," she said softly. "The chickens and the cow. Mrs. Preston said she'd take care of them, but it still hurt." The connection between child and man was immediate and profound, the recognition of shared grief creating a bridge across the years and circumstances that separated them. Thomas looked down at Lucy with an expression of surprised gratitude, as if he hadn't expected to find understanding in such an unlikely place. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said formally, but with genuine feeling. "Your parents must have been remarkable people to raise children with such generous hearts." Samuel looked up from his work with the well rope, his face bright with pride. "They were the best people in the world," he declared with the absolute certainty of childhood loyalty. "Mama could make anything grow, and Papa could fix anything that was broken. They taught us that being poor in money doesn't have to mean being poor in kindness." The wisdom of it, delivered in a child's clear voice, seemed to resonate with Thomas in a way that adult philosophy might not have managed. Martha watched him absorb the lesson, seeing something shift in his expression as he contemplated the idea that poverty of circumstances didn't have to mean poverty of spirit. "There," Samuel announced with satisfaction, giving the repaired rope an experimental tug. "Should hold now. The wire's not pretty, but it'll do the job." He looked to Thomas for approval, and Martha could see how much the boy's confidence meant to the broken man they had found. "That's fine work," Thomas said, and meant it. "I couldn't have managed better myself." He moved to the well and began hauling up the bucket, his movements still careful but noticeably more hopeful than they had been an hour earlier. As darkness began to settle over the prairie in earnest, Martha made a decision that surprised even her with its swiftness and certainty. "Mr. Gibson, I think we need to get you into town tonight. This place won't keep you warm enough, and if that cough gets worse, you'll need to be where Doc Wilson can reach you." Thomas paused in his efforts with the well bucket. "Ma'am, I appreciate the concern, but I can't impose on anyone. Don't have money for lodging, and I won't accept charity." Martha felt her patience beginning to fray. "Mr. Gibson, with respect, you're not in a position to be particular about pride right now. These children walked 3 miles to find help for you, and I've spent my afternoon making sure you don't die of stubbornness. The least you can do is let us finish what we started." Lucy stepped into the awkward silence that followed, her voice carrying the practical wisdom that had kept her and Samuel alive through 6 months of hardship. "Mr. Gibson, maybe you could teach school again. Mrs. Henley's oldest boy needs help with his reading, and lots of folks in town have children who could use proper learning. You could work for your keep." The suggestion was so simple, so obvious in its logic, that Martha wondered why she hadn't thought of it herself. Malachite did need a teacher. The previous one had left for California the spring before, and parents had been struggling to educate their children on their own. Someone with Thomas Gibson's obvious education and refinement would be a godsend to a community starved for intellectual resources. Thomas stared at Lucy as if she had just performed magic. You think people would trust me to teach their children? Looking like this, with no references, no proof of my qualifications." "Can you read?" Samuel asked practically. "Yes, of course." "Can you write and do sums?" "Certainly." "Then you're already better qualified than most of the grown-ups around here," the boy concluded with irrefutable logic. "Besides, Mrs. Henley knows everyone, and if she says you're all right, people will listen." Martha felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders, but it wasn't an unwelcome burden. Something about Thomas Gibson spoke to her instincts as a judge of character. Perhaps it was the way he had automatically shown courtesy despite his desperate circumstances, or the manner in which he responded to the children's kindness with genuine gratitude rather than calculated manipulation. Whatever the source of her confidence, she found herself ready to stake her reputation on her assessment of his character. "There's a room above the general store that's been empty since old Mr. Cooper died," she found herself saying. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. Mrs. Cooper might be willing to rent it in exchange for help with the store and some tutoring for her grandchildren." The offer hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility. Martha could see Thomas wrestling with the concept that his luck might finally be changing, that the relentless string of disappointments and failures that had brought him to this desperate place might actually be coming to an end. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse with emotion he was trying to suppress. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Lucy and Samuel exchanged one of their wordless conversations. Then Lucy stepped forward with the grave dignity of childhood, making an important pronouncement. "Because that's what neighbors do," she said simply, using Martha's earlier words. "And because maybe if we help you, someday when we need help, someone will remember that kindness is supposed to go around and around, not stop with any one person." The philosophy of it, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty by a child who had every reason to be bitter about the world's failures, seemed to break through the last of Thomas Gibson's resistance. Martha watched as something fundamental shifted in his expression, a loosening of the protective barriers he had built around his heart. "All right," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of surrender and hope in equal measure. "All right. If you're certain it won't cause trouble for you, I'd be grateful for the chance to try again." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized what they had just accomplished. In the space of a single afternoon, 2 orphan children had not only saved a man's life but potentially restored his faith in human goodness. The ripple effects of their simple act of compassion were already beginning to spread, creating possibilities that none of them could have imagined when the day began. "Then let's gather what you have and head back to town," she said briskly, falling back on practical action to cover the depth of her emotion. "Samuel, can you help Mr. Gibson with his things? Lucy, we'll want to wrap up any food that might spoil on the walk back." As they began the process of collecting Thomas's meager possessions and organizing their supplies for the return journey, Martha found herself marveling at the strange turns that life could take. This morning she had awakened to another day of worry about winter preparations and community struggles. Tonight she would return home with the knowledge that she had been part of something remarkable, the kind of small miracle that reminded her why she had chosen to make her life in this harsh but beautiful country. The wind that had carried the promise of winter that morning now seemed to whisper of different possibilities. As they prepared to leave the broken dreams of the Miller homestead behind, Martha felt a familiar stirring of hope in her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, new reasons to wonder if they were strong enough to survive whatever the world threw at them. But tonight, walking back toward the lights of Malachite with two wise children and a man they had helped reclaim his faith in human goodness, she felt rich beyond measure in all the ways that truly mattered. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above them, small points of light that suggested that even in the deepest darkness, illumination was always possible for those who remembered to look up and hope. The walk back to Malachite took nearly 2 hours, their pace slowed by Thomas Gibson's weakened condition and the careful way they navigated the uneven prairie in the growing darkness. Martha found herself studying him as they made their way across the familiar terrain, noting how he paused frequently to catch his breath and the way his hand trembled when he reached out to steady himself against fence posts or large stones. The children seemed to understand his limitations instinctively, adjusting their own pace without making him feel self-conscious about his frailty. Lucy walked beside Thomas, chattering softly about the landmarks they passed and the families who lived in each distant homestead, her gentle voice providing a distraction from the physical effort of the journey. Samuel ranged ahead like a young scout, checking for prairie dog holes and other hazards that might catch an unsteady foot in the darkness. Their care for the stranger was so natural, so unconsciously generous, that Martha felt her heart swell with pride for these remarkable children who had somehow emerged from tragedy with their capacity for love intact. "That's the Peterson place," Lucy was saying, pointing toward a distant glow of lamplight. "They have 7 children, and Mrs. Peterson makes the best apple butter in 3 counties. She might want to trade some for reading lessons if you decide to teach school again." The suggestion was offered casually, as if the possibility of Thomas resuming his career was already an established fact rather than a fragile hope. Thomas managed a smile despite his obvious exhaustion. 7 children? That's quite a classroom in itself. His voice carried a note of professional interest that hadn't been there during their earlier conversation, as if discussing the possibility of teaching was beginning to awaken something that had been dormant for too long. 8, if you count the Henderson's boy, Samuel called back from his position ahead of them. "Tommy's not right in the head, but he's eager to learn. Mama used to say that eagerness was worth more than natural ability." The wisdom of Elizabeth Moody, preserved and passed down through her children's memories, continued to guide their understanding of the world even months after her death. Martha noticed how Thomas's expression softened at the mention of Tommy Henderson, a child whose simple nature had made him the subject of cruel jokes among some adults but had apparently earned the Moody twins' acceptance and protection. "Your mother sounds like she was a natural teacher herself," Thomas observed quietly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes the difference between education and mere instruction." Lucy beamed with pride at the compliment to her mother's memory. "She taught us our letters before we were 5, and Samuel could do sums in his head by the time he was 6. She said learning was like planting seeds. You had to tend them regular and be patient while they grew." The metaphor was perfectly suited to their agricultural community, and Martha could see how it resonated with Thomas. His steps seemed to grow marginally steadier as the conversation continued, as if the prospect of returning to meaningful work was providing strength that his body alone couldn't summon. As they crested the low hill that overlooked Malachite, the town spread out below them like a collection of scattered stars, each lighted window representing a family settling in for another evening of frontier life. The sight always moved Martha in ways she couldn't fully articulate. This small collection of determined souls who had chosen to make their stand against the wilderness, creating civilization one building and one friendship at a time. "It's beautiful," Thomas said softly, pausing to take in the view. "I'd forgotten how a town looks when you're coming home to it." The word home seemed to surprise him as soon as he spoke it, as if the concept had slipped out before his mind could censor it. Samuel heard it too and turned back with a grin that was visible even in the darkness. "That's because it's going to be your home now," he said with the absolute certainty of childhood pronouncement. "Mrs. Henley doesn't offer to help unless she means it all the way through." Martha felt a flush of warmth at the boy's confidence in her character. It was true that she didn't make commitments lightly, but she also recognized that what they were attempting would require more than her good intentions. The success of Thomas Gibson's integration into their community would depend on the acceptance and cooperation of dozens of people, each dealing with their own struggles and prejudices. "We should probably visit Mrs. Cooper first," she said as they began the descent toward town. "Get the practical arrangements settled before word spreads and people start forming opinions based on speculation rather than facts." Thomas nodded, understanding the wisdom of controlling the narrative from the beginning. Small communities could be remarkably generous to those they claimed as their own, but they could also be suspicious of strangers until proven otherwise. First impressions would matter enormously in determining whether his second chance would be genuine or merely theoretical. The main street of Malachite was quiet at this hour, most families having retreated indoors for their evening meals and the comfort of lamplight against the growing cold. But Martha could see signs of life behind the curtained windows, shadows moving against the glow, the occasional sound of conversation or children's laughter drifting out into the night. It was the sound of a community at rest, secure in the knowledge that neighbors were nearby and help was available if needed. "Mrs. Cooper lives behind the general store," Lucy explained to Thomas as they approached the two-story building that dominated the commercial section of town. "She's been lonesome since Mr. Cooper passed, and her arthritis makes it hard for her to manage the heavy lifting in the store. Samuel and I help when we can, but we're not big enough for the flour sacks and such." The gentle preparation was typical of the twins' thoughtful nature, Martha noticed. They were already setting the stage for Thomas to see himself as useful rather than burdensome, creating a framework where his presence would solve problems rather than create them. The general store occupied the ground floor of the building, its windows dark now, but the familiar smells of coffee, leather, and various sundries still apparent even from the street. Above, a single window glowed with warm light, and Martha could make out the silhouette of Agnes Cooper moving about in what she knew to be the woman's modest living quarters. "You children wait here while I speak with her first," Martha instructed, climbing the external staircase that led to the upper floor. Sometimes it's easier to explain complicated situations without an audience. She knocked softly on the wooden door, not wanting to startle the elderly woman who lived alone above her late husband's store. Agnes Cooper had been a fixture in Malachite for nearly 20 years, arriving as a young bride and growing into the role of unofficial community grandmother as the decades passed. She was known for her practical wisdom and her ability to see through to the heart of matters that confused other people. "Martha Henley?" Agnes's voice carried through the door, tinged with surprise. "What brings you calling at this hour?" "I have a proposition for you, Agnes," Martha replied, "and possibly a solution to some of your recent troubles." "May I come in?" The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of practical dress that suggested she had been working rather than resting despite the late hour. Agnes Cooper had the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades handling merchandise and counting coins, but her eyes held the keen intelligence that had made her husband's business one of the most successful in 3 counties. Come in," Agnes said, stepping aside to admit her visitor. "I was just going over the books and wondering how I'm going to manage the inventory before winter sets in proper. These old bones aren't getting any younger, and some of those supply boxes weigh more than I do." Martha accepted the offered chair at the small table where Agnes had been working, noting the neat columns of figures that represented the careful calculation required to keep a frontier business afloat. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. I may have found someone who could help with the physical demands of running the store, and in exchange, you might be able to help him get back on his feet." Agnes's eyebrows rose with interest. "Oh, what kind of someone are we talking about?" "A schoolteacher," Martha said, watching the older woman's face carefully. "Fell on hard times and lost his position back in Kansas. He's educated, well-mannered, and desperate for honest work. The Moody twins found him in bad shape at the Miller place and asked me to help." The mention of the twins immediately changed the tone of the conversation. Agnes had a soft spot for Lucy and Samuel, having known their parents well and grieved deeply at their loss. If the children had asked for help, Agnes would be predisposed to provide it. "A teacher, you say? Lord knows we need one. My own grandchildren are getting by on what little I can teach them, but it's not enough for children who deserve better." Agnes leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. "What's his situation exactly?" Martha chose her words carefully, wanting to be honest without making Thomas sound like a charity case. "He's been wandering for months, picking up work where he can find it. Made it as far as our territory before his horse went lame and he had to put it down. Been trying to survive at the Miller place, but he's sick and nearly starved. With winter coming, he wouldn't last another week out there." Agnes nodded grimly. She knew as well as anyone how quickly the frontier could kill those who lacked the resources or support to weather its challenges. "And you think he'd be willing to work for room and board while he recovers his strength?" "I think he'd be grateful for the chance to prove himself," Martha replied. The children suggested he could teach in exchange for lodging. There are plenty of families in town who would pay for proper instruction for their young ones. The practical aspects of the arrangement were appealing to Agnes's business sense, Martha could see. The store needed help, the community needed a teacher, and everyone would benefit from the arrangement if it worked out. But there was still the question of trust, of whether a stranger could be relied upon to honor his commitments and integrate successfully into their tight-knit community. "Bring him up," Agnes said finally. "Let me take a look at him and see what my instincts tell me. If the Moody children vouch for his character, that carries weight. Those two have seen enough of human nature to recognize good from bad." Martha felt a surge of relief at the older woman's willingness to consider the arrangement. Agnes's approval would carry significant influence with other members of the community, making Thomas's acceptance much more likely if she decided to support him. She returned to the street where Thomas waited with the twins, both children looking up at her expectantly. "Mrs. Cooper would like to meet you," she told Thomas. "She's willing to discuss the arrangement, but the final decision will depend on what she thinks of you personally." Thomas straightened his shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength and dignity that his ordeal hadn't entirely depleted. "I understand. I'll do my best to make a good impression." Lucy stepped forward and reached up to straighten his collar, her small hands gentle as she tried to make him more presentable. "Just be yourself," she advised seriously. "Mrs. Cooper can tell when people are putting on airs, and she doesn't like it. But she respects honesty, even when the truth isn't pretty." The advice was sound, Martha knew. Agnes Cooper had little patience for pretense, but she was remarkably generous to those who dealt with her straightforwardly. Thomas's best chance lay in being exactly what he was, a man who had fallen on hard times but retained his essential decency and his desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. They climbed the stairs together, Thomas moving slowly but with evident determination. When Agnes opened the door, Martha watched her face carefully as she took in the sight of their unexpected guest. Thomas's appearance was still shocking. Too thin, too pale, clothes that spoke of weeks of rough living, but his bearing remained that of an educated gentleman despite his circumstances. "Mrs. Cooper," Thomas said, removing his hat with automatic courtesy, "I'm Thomas Gibson. Mrs. Henley tells me you might have work for someone willing to earn his keep through honest labor. I'm grateful for your consideration." His voice carried the cultured tones that marked him as someone who had received proper education, and Martha could see Agnes responding to the evidence of refinement that poverty couldn't entirely erase. The older woman studied him with the measuring gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating character quickly and accurately. "Come in, Mr. Gibson," Agnes said after a moment. Let's sit down and discuss what each of us might have to offer the other." The conversation that followed was a delicate dance of negotiation and mutual assessment. Thomas explained his background honestly. His teaching credentials, his failed attempt at farming, the series of temporary jobs that had brought him steadily westward as opportunities dried up behind him. Agnes outlined the challenges of managing the store alone, the physical demands that were becoming beyond her capabilities, and the community's need for educational services. Lucy and Samuel sat quietly in the corner, their presence serving as silent testimony to Thomas's character. Martha noticed how Agnes's eyes frequently returned to the children, reading in their relaxed demeanor and obvious trust the kind of character reference that no written recommendation could provide. "The room upstairs is small but comfortable," Agnes was saying, gesturing toward a door that presumably led to additional living quarters. "There's a bed, a desk, and space for your personal belongings. In exchange, I'd expect help with the heavy work in the store, unloading shipments, organizing inventory, basic maintenance as needed. The teaching would be separate from our arrangement, something between you and the families who want instruction for their children." Thomas nodded, his expression showing careful attention to every detail. "That seems more than fair, Mrs. Cooper. I'm grateful for your willingness to give me a chance to prove myself." "Don't thank me yet," Agnes replied with practical wisdom. "Proving yourself will take time, and there will be folks in town who'll need convincing that you're worth their trust. Some people are naturally suspicious of strangers, especially when times are hard and everyone's worried about their own troubles." Lucy spoke up from her corner, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "People will trust him once they see how he teaches their children. Papa always said that actions speak louder than words, and teaching is all about actions." Agnes smiled at the girl's confidence. "Your papa was a wise man, child. And you may be right about people coming around. But it'll take time, Mr. Gibson. You'll need patience while folks get used to the idea of you." Thomas's response revealed the depth of his gratitude and his understanding of the opportunity being offered. "Mrs. Cooper, I've had nothing but time for months now, and most of it has been spent wondering if I'd ever have another chance to be useful to anyone. I'm not going to waste this opportunity through impatience or pride." The sincerity in his voice seemed to convince Agnes completely. Martha watched as the older woman's expression softened, her natural maternal instincts responding to the evidence of genuine need and authentic desire to rebuild a meaningful life. "Very well then," Agnes said briskly. "We'll try the arrangement for a month and see how it suits both of us. If it works out, we can discuss making it permanent. If not, no hard feelings, but you'll need to find other accommodations." The trial period was sensible, Martha recognized, protecting both parties while allowing time for the arrangement to prove itself. Thomas's evident relief at having secure shelter and meaningful work was almost painful to witness, suggesting how desperate his circumstances had become. Over the next hour, they worked out the practical details of the arrangement. Agnes showed Thomas the room that would be his, small but clean, with a window overlooking Main Street and furnishings that were simple but adequate. The store's layout was explained, along with the inventory systems and the regular schedule of deliveries and customer patterns. Martha found herself marveling at how quickly the pieces were falling into place. What had begun as a simple act of charity by two children was rapidly evolving into a comprehensive solution that would benefit everyone involved. Thomas would have shelter and purpose, Agnes would have the help she needed, and the community would gain an educated teacher for their children. As they prepared to conclude the evening's negotiations, Samuel spoke up with a question that proved he had been thinking ahead to practical considerations. "Mr. Gibson, will you need help getting your teaching supplies? Books and slates and such for the children to use?" The question revealed both the boy's practical intelligence and his unconscious assumption that the teaching arrangement was already settled. Thomas looked touched by the concern, but also somewhat embarrassed. "I'm afraid I lost most of my teaching materials along the way," he admitted. "Had to sell books for food money when times got particularly hard." I'll need to rebuild my classroom resources from scratch." Agnes made a note on the paper where she had been recording their agreement. There might be some materials left from the previous teacher, and families will provide what they can for their children's education. We'll work out the details as we go. Lucy yawned suddenly, reminding Martha that the children had been awake and active for a very long day. The excitement of their rescue mission was giving way to the exhaustion that came when adrenaline finally faded and normal human needs reasserted themselves. "We should get these young ones home," Martha said, rising from her chair. "It's been a long day for all of us, and tomorrow will bring plenty of work." Thomas stood as well, extending his hand to Agnes with formal courtesy. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," she replied, but her tone was warm rather than stern. "Get some rest, and we'll start fresh in the morning. There's a shipment of supplies coming in on the afternoon stage, and I'll need help unloading and organizing everything." As they prepared to leave, Martha felt a profound sense of satisfaction at what they had accomplished. In the space of a few hours, they had not only saved a man's life but potentially transformed it, creating opportunities that would benefit the entire community. The ripple effects of the twins' simple act of compassion were already spreading far beyond what any of them had imagined when the day began. The walk back to Martha's house took them through the quiet streets of Malachite, past homes where families were settling in for the night, unaware that their community had just gained a new member whose presence would soon touch many of their lives. Thomas moved with more confidence now, no longer the desperate stranger they had found at the Miller place, but a man with prospects and hope for the future. Lucy and Samuel walked between Martha and Thomas, their small forms creating a bridge between the woman who had raised children of her own and the man who was preparing to dedicate himself to educating the children of others. The symbolism wasn't lost on Martha. These remarkable twins, who had lost their own parents but retained their capacity for love and generosity, serving as the connection that would help Thomas find his way back to meaningful life. As they reached Martha's front gate, she turned to address Thomas one final time. "Mr. Gibson, I want you to know that what happened today wasn't charity. It was community, people looking out for each other because that's how we survive in this country. You'll have opportunities to pass the kindness along to others who need it, and when those moments come, I trust you'll remember what it felt like to receive help when you needed it most." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding the responsibility that came with the gift he had been given. "I'll remember, Mrs. Henley, and I'll do everything in my power to prove worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Lucy stepped forward and took his hand in her small one, looking up at him with the grave sincerity that seemed to be her natural expression. "Mr. Gibson, will you teach us too? Samuel and I know our letters and numbers, but Mama said there was always more to learn if you kept your mind open to it." The request seemed to complete something in Thomas's transformation from broken stranger to valued community member. His smile as he looked down at the child who had been instrumental in saving his life was radiant with genuine joy and purpose. "Lucy Moody," he said formally, "it would be my honor to be your teacher. Yours and Samuel's and any other child in this community whose parents trust me with their education. I promise you'll learn things that would make your mama and papa proud." Samuel grinned and stepped forward to join his sister. "Then it's settled. Tomorrow we'll help you get organized, and Mrs. Henley can spread word around town that there's a real teacher available for anyone who wants proper learning for their children." Martha watched the three of them, 2 orphan children and 1 redeemed stranger, and felt her heart swell with the kind of happiness that came from witnessing grace at work in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test the bonds of trust and community they had forged today. But tonight, under the vast sky of the frontier, she felt rich beyond measure in all the ways that truly mattered. The stars that had been mere points of light when they began their journey home now seemed to shine with particular brightness, as if the universe itself was celebrating the small miracle they had been privileged to participate in. In finding each other, they had discovered something more precious than gold or land or any material treasure. They had found the enduring truth that kindness, once offered freely, had the power to transform lives in ways that none of them could have predicted, but all of them would remember for the rest of their days. As Martha tucked the twins into her spare room for the night, their own soddy being too far and too cold for safe travel in the dark, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the wisdom that had led her to trust in the goodness of two remarkable children. Their hearts had seen what adult eyes might have missed, and their courage had opened doors that fear and practicality might have kept closed. Tomorrow, the people of Malachite would learn that their community had gained not just a new resident, but a teacher whose gratitude would inspire him to give his best to every child entrusted to his care. The story of the orphaned twins who found the starving cowboy would become part of their town's folklore, told and retold as an example of what could happen when hearts remained open to love even in the darkest times. But tonight, as silence settled over the prairie and honest exhaustion claimed them all, the most important truth was simply this: they had found each other, and in finding each other, they had discovered that hope was always possible for those who remembered to look for light even in the deepest darkness.